On a first-class flight, a wealthy businessman demands that a black woman be removed, insisting she doesn't belong. The situation escalates as passengers watch, tension thick in the air. Just when he thinks authority is on his side, the airline captain arrives and delivers a shocking revelation. "Sir, this woman is my mother." The businessman is left speechless and humiliated, realizing his privilege has failed him. With no choice but to apologize, he sits in silence as justice takes its course. The woman, poised and dignified, remains unfazed, proving that grace always wins over prejudice. The luxurious first-class cabin hums with quiet conversations, the soft clink of champagne glasses, and the steady drone of the aircraft slicing through the sky. Passengers settle into their plush leather seats, some reading, others enjoying the serenity of an exclusive flight experience. But the calm is shattered by a sharp, commanding voice. Richard Hollingsworth, a wealthy businessman in his 50s, stands rigid, his face contorted with disdain as he glares at Dr. Eleanor Carter, an elegant black woman seated beside him. He gestures furiously at her, his voice rising above the quiet luxury of the cabin. "She doesn't belong here. Get her out of this cabin." The flight attendant, a young woman caught between duty and the undeniable tension of the moment, hesitates. Other passengers exchange uneasy glances, sensing the storm brewing. Some shift uncomfortably in their seats, while a few discreetly pull out their phones, capturing the confrontation in hushed disbelief. Eleanor remains unshaken. Clad in a crisp white blazer, her silver hair frames a face marked with quiet wisdom. She meets Richard's enraged gaze with composed indifference, refusing to dignify his aggression with a response. Her silence unsettles him even more. Then, measured footsteps echo through the cabin. A powerful presence enters, instantly commanding attention. The airline captain strides in, his uniform crisp, his stance firm. His eyes flick between Richard and Eleanor, analyzing the situation with practiced authority. What happens next will leave everyone speechless. Before we dive in, tell us in the comments, have you ever witnessed discrimination firsthand? Let's spread awareness and stand against injustice. The first-class cabin exuded luxury, designed for those who could afford the privilege. The soft glow of ambient lighting reflected off polished surfaces, casting a warm hue over the plush leather seats. A faint clink of fine crystal echoed as flight attendants moved gracefully, pouring champagne into tall glasses. The air carried the scent of premium leather, fresh linens, and a hint of expensive cologne. The passengers, dressed in tailored suits and designer outfits, settled in for what should have been an uneventful, comfortable flight. Dr. Eleanor Carter adjusted the pearl earring on her right ear, her fingers brushing against her silver hair, as she leaned back into her seat. A woman of poise and quiet dignity, she had spent decades in the medical field, earning respect for her intelligence and grace. At 62, she moved through life with effortless confidence, accustomed to traveling, first class on her many professional and personal trips. Today was no different. At least, it shouldn't have been. Across from her, Richard Hollingsworth stiffened. He had barely noticed Eleanor when she first walked in, assuming she was an attendant or perhaps someone lost on her way to economy. But when she gracefully sank into the plush leather seat beside him, he froze, his sharp blue eyes narrowing in disbelief. He straightened his cufflinks, his posture growing rigid as his gaze bore into her. Eleanor ignored the subtle hostility radiating. From the man next to her, she had encountered men like him before, men who assumed they dictated the rules of the world. Instead, she calmly unfolded her cashmere shawl, draping it over her lap before reaching for the glass of champagne that had been placed on her side. Au table. She sipped it delicately, her expression unreadable, but she was well aware of the tension brewing beside her. Richard cleared his throat, his fingers tightening around the armrest. His discomfort quickly turned to annoyance, then to something far more hostile. He turned toward Eleanor briefly, looking her up and down before flagging down a passing flight attendant. His lips curled in disgust as he leaned toward her. "Excuse me," he said, his voice clipped, deliberate. "I think there's been a mistake." The flight attendant, a young woman in a neatly pressed uniform, hesitated. "A mistake, sir?" "Yes," Richard snapped, nodding toward Eleanor. "I believe she's in the wrong section." Eleanor didn't react. She simply continued sipping. Her drink, her expression unfazed. The flight attendant, caught off guard, glanced at Eleanor, then back at Richard. "Sir, Dr. Carter is in her assigned seat." Richard's jaw clenched. "That's impossible." The soft murmurs of conversation in the cabin began to die down as other passengers took notice of the interaction. A woman, a few seats away, discreetly glanced over her magazine, pretending to read while listening in. A man across the aisle raised a brow, shifting slightly in his seat. The flight attendants exchanged brief, uneasy glances, sensing the brewing confrontation. Eleanor finally lowered her glass and met Richard's gaze with unwavering calm. She didn't need to say anything. Her silence, her presence alone, was a challenge to everything he believed. Richard's nostrils flared as he exhaled sharply, his frustration mounting. He wasn't used to being questioned. He wasn't used to not getting his way. And he wasn't done yet. Richard leaned forward aggressively, his voice sharp and cutting as he snapped at the flight attendant. "This is first class," he hissed, his tone dripping with entitlement. "I paid for a premium experience. I don't want to sit next to someone like her." The words hung in the air, thick with venom. A hush fell over the cabin as nearby passengers stiffened, their gazes flickering toward the confrontation. Some exchanged knowing looks, others shifted uncomfortably in their seats, but no one spoke. The flight attendant, caught between protocol and the escalating tension, swallowed hard, her hands clasped nervously in front of her. Eleanor remained composed, elegantly lifting her glass and taking a slow sip of champagne. She didn't flinch, didn't look his way, didn't even acknowledge his existence. The very act of ignoring him was enough to make Richard seethe. The flight attendant's voice wavered slightly, but she stood firm. "Sir, she has every right to be here. This is her assigned seat." Richard's face darkened. His fingers gripped the armrests, knuckles whitening. "Either she leaves," he spat, his voice low and dangerous, "or I do." A ripple of murmurs spread through the cabin, the weight of the moment pressing down on everyone. Some passengers discreetly pulled out their phones, angling them just enough to record the brewing storm. In the back, a well-dressed couple exchanged exasperated glances, shaking their heads in disgust. The flight attendant hesitated, looking toward Eleanor, who remained unfazed. Her calmness only infuriated Richard further. His voice rose, his composure cracking. "I will not tolerate this," he bellowed, his anger spilling into the quiet space. "You people are always trying to take what isn't yours." A gasp came from a few seats away. The words were out now, no way to take them back. even those who had tried to avoid getting involved couldn't ignore the weight of what had just been said. Finally, Eleanor lowered her glass. She turned to Richard, meeting his furious gaze with quiet strength. Her voice was steady, even, and utterly unshaken. "And what exactly do you think I'm taking?" Her words sliced through the moment like a knife, cutting through the noise, and leaving only a heavy silence in its wake. Richard's jaw tensed, his confidence faltering for just a second. The tension in the air reached a breaking point. The situation was spiraling out of control. The tension in the cabin reached its peak, thick and suffocating. The flight attendant stood frozen, unsure of how to proceed, while Richard sat upright, his chest heaving with indignation. The murmurs among the passengers grew louder, some openly recording the confrontation now. Eleanor remained composed, unshaken by the storm unfolding around her. Then, footsteps. Steady, measured, and deliberate. The sound carried through the cabin, silencing the hushed whispers as a new presence entered the scene. The airline captain, a man of authority and control, stepped forward. His uniform was immaculate, the golden stripes on his sleeves gleaming under the soft cabin lights. His face was calm, unreadable, his posture exuding quiet strength. He stopped in front of Richard and Eleanor, his gaze sweeping the tense scene before him. "What seems to be the issue here?" His voice was even, commanding but not aggressive. Richard's lips curled into a smirk, relief washing over him as he leaned back in his seat. Finally, someone with authority. Someone who would put an end to this nonsense. Finally, Richard exhaled dramatically, shaking his head. He gestured toward Eleanor with exaggerated frustration. "This woman is in first class and refuses to move. I demand you handle this." A hush fell over the cabin. Every passenger sat rigid in their seats, their eyes bouncing between the businessman and the captain. The tension was palpable, the outcome hanging in the air like an unresolved note. The captain turned his gaze to Eleanor. He studied her with an unreadable expression, his face giving nothing away. Eleanor, ever graceful, met his eyes with the same quiet dignity she had maintained throughout the ordeal. Then, after a beat of silence, the captain turned back to Richard. His expression remained neutral, but his voice was clear, firm, and unwavering as he spoke the words that would shatter everything. "Sir, this woman is my mother." The words hit like a thunderclap. A gasp rippled through the cabin, shockwaves of realization crashing over the passengers. The shift in the atmosphere was immediate, the very energy in the space turning against Richard in an instant. Richard blinked, his mouth slightly open, confusion flickering across his face. He stopped, his voice failing him. Passengers exchanged stunned glances. Some shook their heads in disbelief, others whispered amongst themselves. The ones who had been recording zoomed in, capturing every detail of Richard's crumbling arrogance. Eleanor remained still, her expression unchanging, though there was the faintest glimmer of amusement in her eyes. Richard stuttered, struggling to find words. I didn't." He inhaled sharply, his face paling as the weight of his mistake settled in. The captain didn't move. He didn't flinch. He simply stepped forward, his presence even more commanding. His eyes locked onto Richard, his voice unwavering. "Now," he said, cool and measured, "would you like to leave, or shall we continue this flight in peace?" The words held no room for argument. No room for negotiation. It was a final verdict, an ultimatum wrapped in quiet authority. Richard's mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. His confidence had evaporated, his usual entitlement replaced with pure humiliation. He was no longer in control, no longer the dominant figure he had believed himself to be. Passengers stared at him expectantly, waiting to see how he would respond. Some looked disgusted, others satisfied. A few were barely concealing their smirks, reveling in the poetic justice of the moment. Richard swallowed hard, shrinking into his seat. The fight had drained out of him completely. The businessman who had been so sure of his superiority just minutes ago now looked smaller, diminished. The captain held his gaze for another moment before stepping back. The decision was made. The power had shifted. The flight would continue, but Richard Hollingsworth would never be the same again. Richard's face drained of color. His smug arrogance, once so bold and unwavering, vanished in an instant. His lips parted slightly. But no, words came out. He blinked rapidly as if hoping he had misheard, as if willing the moment to rewind itself. But there was no escape. The words had been spoken, loud and clear. Eleanor remained still, her expression unchanged. She didn't need to speak. She didn't need to gloat. Her silence carried more weight than any words ever could. She simply watched Richard with the same quiet dignity she had maintained from the very beginning. The moment stretched unbearably long, the hush in the cabin amplifying Richard's humiliation. The captain didn't move, his stance firm, his presence protective. His very posture made it clear. He was standing by his mother. And he wasn't. Just her son at this moment. He was her shield, her defender, the authority Richard could not challenge. Then a sound, a slow, deliberate clap. A woman, a few seats away, elegantly dressed, brought her hands together in a rhythmic motion. The sound echoed through the cabin, breaking the heavy silence. Another person joined in, then another. The applause, hesitant at first, began to build. The tension in the room shifted, transforming from discomfort to something more profound, an undeniable sense of justice. The claps grew louder, stronger. Some passengers nodded in silent approval, others exchanged satisfied glances. A man near. The back let out a chuckle. A woman recording the incident on her phone muttered under her breath. Karma at its finest. Richard sat frozen, his world crumbling around him. He glanced around wildly, searching for a sympathetic face, someone, anyone, who might take his side, but there was no one. No allies, no supporters. The very system he had believed would protect him, the very privilege he had relied on, had turned against him in the blink of an eye. He was alone. For the first time in his life, Richard Hollingsworth had no power. The captain's gaze lingered on Richard for a brief moment before he turned to the flight attendant, his voice calm but firm. "Ensure my mother has everything she needs." The flight attendant nodded immediately, relief washing over her as she moved toward Eleanor with a warm, respectful smile. "Dr. Carter, is there anything I can get you?" she asked softly. Eleanor, as dignified as ever, simply shook her head. "I'm quite comfortable, thank you." Her voice was steady, poised, completely unshaken by the ordeal she had just endured. Richard sat rigidly in his seat, his hands gripping the armrests. His eyes darted around the cabin, looking for something, anything, to regain control of the situation. A lifeline, an escape. but there was none. The passengers who had once ignored him now watched him with a mixture of contempt and quiet satisfaction. Their gazes were no longer indifferent. They had judged him, and they had found him wanting. He swallowed hard, the weight of his own humiliation pressing down on him, like an invisible force. His throat felt dry. His heart pounded. Then, barely above a whisper, he mumbled, I apologize. The words came out strained, forced. He didn't say them because he wanted to. He said them because he had to, because there was no other choice. The captain didn't react. He didn't acknowledge the apology, didn't even glance in Richard's direction. Instead, he simply turned away, as if the words had never been spoken. His message was clear. Some actions don't deserve forgiveness. The moment lingered, heavy with unspoken lessons. The reality of the situation settled over the cabin like a dense fog. No one rushed to comfort Richard. No one offered him sympathy. He had wielded his privilege like a weapon, assuming it would grant him superiority. Instead, it had left him exposed, vulnerable, powerless. Eleanor, undisturbed, exhaled slowly and closed her eyes. A quiet moment of peace. Richard, on the other hand, sat stiffly in his seat, staring at the floor. He couldn't meet anyone's gaze. He couldn't even look up. The shame was suffocating, pressing down on him with a force he had never known before. The passengers, the flight crew, everyone in the cabin had witnessed history. A rare moment where justice had prevailed instantly, where the usual power dynamics had been flipped on their head. The silent triumph in the air was almost palpable. The flight continued, the cabin settling into a calm rhythm once more. But Richard Hollingsworth would never forget this flight, and neither would anyone else. As the flight continued its smooth journey through the skies, the tension that once gripped the cabin slowly faded, replaced by a quiet sense of justice. Eleanor remained serene, her eyes closed, untouched by the hostility she had faced. The captain returned to his duties, knowing he had done more than just resolve a passenger dispute. He had set a precedent, one that everyone aboard would remember. Richard, now a shadow of his former self, remained hunched in his seat, his gaze fixed on the floor, trapped in the weight of his own humiliation. Moments like these remind us that racism still exists, but so does justice. It takes courage to stand up against discrimination, to challenge entitlement, and to remind the world that dignity and respect are not privileges, they are rights. What would you have done in this situation? Comment below. Your voice matters. In the fight against injustice, if you believe in standing up for equality and respect, share this story. Let's make the world a better place, one story at a time. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications for more powerful real-life stories that shine a light on truth, justice, and humanity. Until next time, stay strong, stay kind, and remember, humanity always wins.